Welcome to Crime Story Chronicles. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button for more eerie, true crime mysteries. And to all our returning viewers, thank you for being part of this journey into the darkest corners of human nature. The mattock struck flesh with a sickening thud that echoed through the barn. 6 times it rose and fell. 6 times it found its mark. And in that moment, on a remote Bavarian farm called Hinterkaifeck, an entire family's fate was sealed by hands that belonged to someone they trusted, someone who had been watching, waiting, perhaps even living among them for days. What happened next would become Germany's most haunting unsolved mystery, a puzzle so twisted that nearly a century later, we're still asking the same chilling question: who was living in their home before they died? Hinterkaifeck wasn't just a farm. It was an island of isolation floating in the vast Bavarian wilderness, 6 kilometers from the nearest village of Kaifeck. Here, in this pocket of rural Germany, where rumors traveled faster than horses and secrets festered like wounds, the Gruber family had carved out their existence. But by March 1922, something sinister had already begun to unfold. Something that would transform their sanctuary into a tomb. The signs were there, footprints in the snow leading to the house but never leaving, strange sounds in the attic, tools going missing only to reappear in impossible places. Andreas Gruber, the 63-year-old patriarch, had noticed them all. He just didn't realize he was cataloging the breadcrumbs of his own destruction. Kazilia Gruber moved through her kitchen like a woman trapped in amber. Every gesture precise, every routine a prayer against the chaos she felt pressing against her windows. At 72, she had survived wars, famines, and the death of her husband. But nothing had prepared her for the feeling that invisible eyes were tracking her every movement. Someone's been in the barn again, her son Andreas had told her that morning, his weathered face creased with worry. The hay's been disturbed, and there are cigarette butts where no one should be smoking. But it wasn't just the barn. It was everywhere, as if their entire world had become a stage and they were unwitting performers in someone else's deadly play. The footprints appeared on March 25th, 6 days before the massacre. Andreas discovered them during his morning rounds. Deep impressions in the snow that emerged from the forest and led directly to their front door. But here's what made his blood run cold. There were no footprints leading away. Whoever had made those tracks was either still inside the house or had vanished into thin air. Andreas followed the trail with growing dread, his breath forming frozen clouds as he circled the property, searching for answers that seemed to mock him with their absence. That night, he loaded his hunting rifle and placed it beside his bed, but sleep eluded him like smoke through his fingers. The tools told their own story of intrusion. Andreas found his mattock, a heavy farming tool used for breaking soil, moved from its usual place by the barn door to a corner where it had no business being. Hay bales were rearranged, creating what looked almost like a hiding place, a nest where someone could observe the family's daily routines without being seen. But the most unsettling discovery came when he climbed into the hayloft and found impressions in the straw, depressions that suggested someone had been lying there for hours, watching the house below through gaps in the wooden boards. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't alone, and they hadn't been alone for quite some time. Victoria Gruber Gabriel, Andreas's 35-year-old daughter, had her own reasons for fear. A widow with 2 children, 7-year-old Kazilia and 2-year-old Joseph, she had returned to her father's farm seeking safety after her husband's death in the Great War. But safety was the last thing Hinterkaifeck offered. She confided in her neighbor, Maria Baumgartner, about the strange sounds that echoed through the house at night. Footsteps in the attic when everyone was accounted for downstairs. Doors creaking open when no one was near them. The persistent feeling that someone was breathing just outside her bedroom door. "It's like we're living with ghosts," she whispered during their last conversation, not knowing how prophetic those words would prove to be. The village of Kaifeck buzzed with whispers about the Gruber family, but not the kind of whispers born from concern. In rural Bavaria, where Catholic morality was as rigid as the winter frost, Victoria Gruber Gabriel was a source of scandalous speculation. You see, her youngest child, Joseph, bore no resemblance to her deceased husband, and the timing of his birth raised eyebrows and wagging tongues. The father was widely suspected to be her own father, Andreas, a rumor that had isolated the family even further from their community. But gossip and judgment were luxuries the dead couldn't afford, and by March 31st, all the village scandals would pale in comparison to the horror that was about to unfold. Maria Baumgartner was the last person to see the Gruber family alive. As their nearest neighbor and Victoria's closest friend, she had planned to visit the farm on March 31st to help with the spring cleaning. But when she arrived at the usual time, the house felt wrong. Too quiet, too still, like a held breath that would never be released. She knocked on the door, called out to the family, even peered through windows, but there was no response. The animals in the barn were crying out in hunger and distress, and smoke still rose from the chimney, suggesting recent human activity. But where was everyone? Maria's instinct screamed danger, but social convention demanded she respect the family's privacy. She returned home with a growing sense of dread, not knowing she had just witnessed the aftermath of a massacre. What Maria couldn't see from outside was the carnage hidden within the barn. The Gruber family hadn't simply vanished. They had been systematically slaughtered with a brutality that spoke of rage, intimate knowledge, and chilling premeditation. Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, and 7-year-old Kazilia had been lured or forced into the barn, where they were struck down with their own mattock. The killer knew their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was an execution carried out by someone who understood every aspect of their lives, someone who had been studying them like specimens under glass. But the horror didn't end in the barn. Inside the house, 2-year-old Joseph lay in his crib, alive but alone, his cries echoing through empty rooms. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, a different Maria than their neighbor, had been killed in her bed, her skull crushed with the same methodical violence that had claimed the others. The killer had moved through the house like death itself, leaving no witnesses except for a terrified toddler who couldn't speak of what he had seen. For days, little Joseph's cries had grown weaker, his small voice the only sound in a house transformed into a mausoleum. When the villagers finally organized a search party on April 4th, 4 days after the murders, they approached Hinterkaifeck with the reluctant steps of mourners attending their own funeral. Led by Jacob Sigel, a local farmer who had grown concerned about the family's absence from church. The group included the postman, who had been unable to deliver mail, and several neighbors who had noticed the animals' distressed cries carrying on the wind. They found the front door unlocked, the house eerily preserved as if its inhabitants had simply stepped out for a moment and would return at any time. But the smell, that sweet, cloying scent of death, told a different story entirely. Jacob Sigel pushed open the barn doors and immediately stumbled backward, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a scream. There, arranged like discarded dolls, lay 4 members of the Gruber family. Andreas lay on his side, his head caved in, his hands still clutched around a lantern he had been carrying when death found him. Kazilia, the elderly matriarch, was crumpled near the barn door, her gray hair matted with blood. Victoria lay beside her daughter, 7-year-old Kazilia. their bodies positioned in a way that suggested the mother had tried to shield her child in their final moments. The mattock, the murder weapon, lay nearby, its blade dark with dried blood and tufts of hair. Inside the house, the scene was no less horrifying, but infinitely more puzzling. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, had been killed in her bed, but the room showed no signs of struggle. She had been asleep when death came for her, never knowing she was about to become the sixth victim of Germany's most baffling murder case. 2-year-old Joseph was found alive, but barely conscious, dehydrated and weak from days without food or care. He would survive, but he would carry no memories of those terrible days. Perhaps the only mercy in this entire tragedy. The police officers who processed the scene would later describe it as one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever encountered, not just for its brutality, but for its inexplicable details. Here's where the Hinterkaifeck case transcends ordinary murder and enters the realm of the supernatural. The evidence suggested that someone had been living in the house for days after the murders, calmly going about domestic routines, while 6 corpses decomposed nearby. Fresh meals had been prepared and partially consumed. The animals had been fed and cared for. Firewood had been chopped and neatly stacked. Most disturbing of all, neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney for 3 consecutive days after the family's death. Smoke that could only have been produced by someone maintaining the fires, someone who was comfortable enough in the house of the dead to treat it as their temporary home. Detective George Reingruber had seen his share of violence during his 20-year career with the Bavarian police, but the Hinterkaifeck murders challenged everything he thought he knew about criminal behavior. The methodical nature of the killings, combined with the killer's apparent comfort in remaining at the scene, suggested a perpetrator who was either completely detached from reality or operating according to a logic that defied conventional understanding. Reingruber spent hours studying the crime scene photographs, searching for patterns that would unlock the mystery, but each clue seemed to contradict the others, creating a puzzle that grew more complex with every piece he tried to fit into place. The physical evidence painted a picture of premeditation that was as meticulous as it was terrifying. The killer had clearly spent time observing the family, learning their routines, understanding their vulnerabilities. The footprints in the snow were just the beginning. Investigators found evidence of a campsite in the nearby forest, complete with the remains of small fires and food scraps that suggested someone had been conducting surveillance for weeks, possibly months. Cigarette butts of a brand not smoked by any family member were scattered throughout the property, and several tools showed signs of having been handled by unfamiliar hands. As news of the murders spread through the region, theories multiplied like weeds after rain. Some villagers whispered about the family's dark secrets, the rumors of incest, the mysterious paternity of young Joseph, the bitter feuds over property and inheritance that had simmered beneath the surface of rural respectability. Others spoke of supernatural explanations, vengeful spirits, ancient curses, or demonic possession that could account for the killer's ability to move through the house undetected. But Detective Reingruber was a man of science and logic, and he was determined to find a rational explanation for what appeared to be an irrational crime. The geographic isolation of Hinterkaifeck presented both challenges and opportunities for the investigation. On one hand, the remote location meant fewer potential witnesses and a larger area to search for evidence. On the other hand, it also meant that anyone unfamiliar with the terrain would have had difficulty navigating to and from the property without local knowledge. This suggested that the killer was either from the immediate area or had spent considerable time studying the landscape. Reingruber began compiling a list of everyone who had both the geographic knowledge and the personal motivation to commit such a heinous crime. 3 weeks into the investigation, Detective Reingruber made a discovery that would change everything he thought he knew about the Hinterkaifeck murders. While reviewing old police reports from the region, he found a file that made his blood run cold. 6 months before the murders, Andreas Gruber had filed a complaint about a mysterious intruder on his property. The details were chillingly familiar. Disturbed hay in the barn, missing tools, unexplained footprints, and the persistent feeling of being watched. But here's the detail that stopped Reingruber in his tracks. Andreas had specifically mentioned finding a newspaper in his house that he hadn't purchased, open to an article about a violent crime in a neighboring district. "I'm telling you, officer, someone's been in my house. Not just the barn, inside the house itself. I found strange items moved around, food missing from the pantry, and yesterday, I discovered that someone had been sleeping in our spare room. The bed was made, but not the way my wife makes it. Someone else had been lying there, and they wanted us to know it." The police officer who had taken Andreas's complaint had dismissed it as the paranoid fantasies of an aging farmer, but Reingruber recognized the pattern immediately. Someone had been stalking the Gruber family for at least 6 months before the murders, gradually escalating from external surveillance to actually entering their home. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random act of violence. It was the culmination of an extended campaign of psychological torture that had been building toward its inevitable, bloody conclusion. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. While cross-referencing the complaint file with regional death records, Reingruber discovered that the previous year, another isolated farming family had been murdered in a strikingly similar manner, bludgeoned to death with farming tools, their bodies arranged in their barn, evidence of someone living in their house after the murders. The case had been closed when a vagrant confessed the crime, but now Reingruber wondered if they had caught the wrong man. The similarities were too precise to be coincidental, suggesting that the Gruber family weren't the first victims of what might have been a serial killer who targeted isolated rural families. The forensic analysis of the Hinterkaifeck crime scene revealed details that would haunt investigators for decades. The killer had used the family's own mattock to commit the murders, striking each victim multiple times with methodical precision. But the most disturbing finding came from the analysis of the house itself. Fingerprints found on dishes, door handles, and personal items confirmed that someone had indeed been living in the house for days after the murders, moving through the rooms as if they owned the place, preparing meals in a kitchen just yards away from where 6 people lay decomposing. Imagine, if you can, the psychology of someone who could kill 6 people and then calmly make themselves a home in their victim's house. The evidence suggested that the killer had cooked meals using the family's food, slept in their beds, worn their clothes, and maintained the property as if they were the rightful inhabitants. This level of psychological detachment pointed to someone who was either completely delusional or operating according to a twisted logic that viewed the murder victims as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings to be mourned. But let's not forget the real tragedy here. 6 human beings whose lives were cut short by an act of incomprehensible violence. Andreas Gruber, the hard-working patriarch who had built the farm with his own hands. Kazilia Gruber, the elderly matriarch who had survived wars and famines only to die in her own barn. Victoria Gabriel, the young widow who had sought safety for her children and found only death. 7-year-old Kazilia, whose only crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. The maid Maria Baumgartner, who had simply been in the wrong place when evil came calling. And little Joseph, who survived but would grow up never knowing his family, never understanding why he alone was spared. As the investigation expanded, Detective Reingruber began to see connections that painted an even more disturbing picture. The killer's intimate knowledge of the property, their ability to navigate the house in darkness, their familiarity with the family's routines. All of this suggested someone who had been observing them for an extended period, possibly someone who had worked on the farm or had access to the property in a professional capacity. The list of suspects grew to include farmhands, tradesmen, religious figures, and even family members who might have harbored grudges over inheritance or family secrets. Among the primary suspects was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor and former lover of Victoria Gabriel. Schlittenbauer had been one of the first to arrive at the crime scene, and his behavior during the discovery had struck many as odd. He had seemed more curious than shocked, more interested in examining the bodies than in expressing grief or horror. But here's what made investigators particularly suspicious. Schlittenbauer had openly claimed to be the father of Victoria's youngest child, Joseph, and had been pressing her to marry him despite her consistent refusals. Had his desire for Victoria and his claim to paternity driven him to eliminate the obstacles standing in his way? Under questioning, Schlittenbauer's alibi proved frustratingly vague. He claimed to have been working on his own farm during the time of the murders, but had no witnesses to corroborate his story. More troubling still, he possessed intimate knowledge of the Hinterkaifeck property and the family's daily routines, having visited frequently under the pretense of courting Victoria. When investigators searched his property, they found tools that could have been used to commit the murders, though none showed definitive evidence of having been used in the crime. Schlittenbauer maintained his innocence, but his nervous demeanor and contradictory statements kept him at the top of the suspect list. Another theory centered on the possibility of a vagrant or itinerant worker who had been hiding in the surrounding forest. The evidence of a campsite, combined with the killer's apparent lack of permanent ties to the area, suggested someone who lived on the margins of society, possibly a war veteran suffering for what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The Great War had left thousands of men psychologically damaged and socially displaced, and some had turned to violence as a way of coping with their trauma. Could the Hinterkaifeck murders have been the work of such a man, someone who had fixated on the family as symbols of the stability and peace he could never achieve? This theory gained credibility when investigators discovered that several vagrants had been reported in the area during the weeks leading up to the murders. One in particular, a former soldier named Carl Gabriel, who shared a surname with Victoria but was believed to be unrelated, had been seen near the property on multiple occasions. Gabriel had been discharged from the army due to what military doctors termed nervous exhaustion, and had been living rough in the Bavarian countryside ever since. When police attempted to locate him for questioning, they found that he had vanished from the area immediately after the murders. His abandoned campsite, discovered miles away, with clear signs of a hasty departure. But perhaps the darkest theory centered on the family's own secrets. Specifically, the persistent rumors about the true parentage of young Joseph. In Kassel, Bavaria, the suggestion of incest was more than scandalous. It was grounds for complete social ostracism and, in some minds, divine punishment. Father Otmar, the local priest, reluctantly confirmed to investigators that he had refused to baptize Joseph due to concerns about his paternity, and that he had been pressuring the family to confess their sins and seek redemption. Had someone in the community decided to take justice into their own hands, viewing the murders as a form of righteous cleansing? The investigation revealed that the Gruber family had become increasingly isolated in their final months, shunned by neighbors who had once been friends. Andreas had reportedly received threatening letters, though none were ever recovered, and Victoria had confided to Maria Baumgartner that she felt watched wherever she went in the village. The social pressure had been building like steam in a boiler, and some investigators wondered if the murders were the inevitable explosion of a community's moral outrage. But if so, who had appointed themselves as executioner? And how had they managed to carry out such a methodical killing without leaving any definitive evidence? There was also the disturbing possibility that the killer was someone within the extended family itself, someone who knew the property intimately, understood the family's routines, and had both motive and opportunity to commit the crime. Andreas Gruber had several brothers and nephews who lived in the region, and property disputes had created bitter feuds that simmered for years. Inheritance laws in Bavaria could be complex and contentious, and there were rumors that Andreas had been planning to change his will in a way that would have disinherited certain relatives. Could one of his own family members have decided to solve their financial problems with a mattock? The financial motive gained credibility when investigators discovered that the Hinterkaifeck farm was worth significantly more than most people realized. Andreas had been quietly acquiring additional land over the years, and recent surveys had revealed mineral deposits on the property that could have made the family wealthy. Several relatives had approached him about selling the land, and his refusals had generated considerable resentment. When his will was finally read, it revealed that he had indeed been planning significant changes to his inheritance arrangements, changes that would have left several family members empty-handed. Had someone killed him to prevent those changes from taking effect? Despite an investigation that eventually involved over 100 suspects and generated thousands of pages of testimony, the Hinterkaifeck murders remained unsolved. Detective Rain Gruber exhausted every lead, pursued every theory, and questioned everyone with even the slightest connection to the case, but the killer's identity remained as elusive as smoke. The property was eventually sold at auction, and the new owners demolished the buildings, unable to bear living in a place where such horror had occurred. But the questions lingered like ghosts, haunting everyone who had been touched by the case. In 1923, nearly a year after the murders, the case was officially closed due to lack of evidence. The various suspects had been released, their alibis deemed sufficient or their motives insufficiently proven. Lorenz Schlittenbauer returned to his farm, forever marked by suspicion, but never formally charged. Karl Gabriel was never found, vanishing into the rootless population of post-war Germany like a stone dropped into dark water. The family members who had been investigated gradually rebuilt their relationships with each other, though the shadow of suspicion never entirely lifted. The case became a cautionary tale about the limits of justice and the way evil can sometimes slip through the cracks of human understanding. To understand the Hinterkaifeck murders, we must understand the world in which they occurred. Post-war Germany was a nation in psychological and social turmoil, struggling to rebuild not just its economy, but its sense of moral order. Traditional authorities have been discredited, social hierarchies have been disrupted, and millions of men had returned from the trenches carrying trauma that their society had no language to describe or treat. In this context, the murders can be seen not just as an isolated crime, but as a symptom of a civilization trying to heal from wounds that ran deeper than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Today, nearly a century later, the Hinterkaifeck case continues to fascinate criminologists, historians, and amateur detectives around the world. New theories emerge regularly, powered by advances in forensic science and psychological profiling that weren't available to Detective Rain Gruber and his team. Some modern investigators believe they've identified the killer among the original suspects, while others argue that the true perpetrator was never even investigated. DNA analysis of preserved evidence has been suggested, but never successfully completed, leaving the mystery as impenetrable as ever. What would we discover if we could apply today's investigative techniques to the Hinterkaifeck crime scene? Advanced DNA analysis might identify trace evidence that 1920s investigators couldn't detect. Psychological profiling could provide insights into the killer's mindset and probable background. Geographic profiling might narrow down the search area for the perpetrator's base of operations. Ballistics analysis, though no firearms were used, could perhaps provide more precise information about the murder weapon and how it was wielded. But these are tools that the dead cannot benefit from, and justice delayed is often justice denied entirely. The questions that surround the Hinterkaifeck murders are as numerous as they are disturbing. Who was the person living in the house after the murders? And why did they feel comfortable staying in such a macabre environment? How did the killer manage to lure or force 4 people into the barn where they would be systematically murdered? Why was 2-year-old Joseph spared when everyone else was killed? Did the killer know the child? Or was there some other reason for showing mercy to the youngest victim? And perhaps most haunting of all, if this was indeed the work of a serial killer, how many other families suffered similar fates in remote locations where their deaths might never have been properly investigated? Modern researchers have identified at least 3 other similar cases in the region during the same general time period. Isolated farming families murdered with farm tools, evidence of post-mortem habitation of their homes, and investigations that failed to identify definitive suspects. While none of these cases received the attention that Hinterkaifeck did, the similarities are striking enough to suggest that a serial killer might have been operating in rural Bavaria during the early 1920s, preying on families whose isolation made them vulnerable and whose deaths might go unnoticed for days or weeks. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Hinterkaifeck case is the possibility that the killer simply walked away and disappeared into the anonymous masses of post-war Europe. Without fingerprint databases, criminal profiling, or modern communication networks, it would have been relatively easy for someone to commit such a crime and then vanish entirely, perhaps to surface years later in a different country with a new identity and a clean slate. The killer might have lived for decades after the murders, carrying the secret of their crimes to the grave, never facing justice for the 6 lives they had destroyed on that terrible night in March 1922. As I stand here where the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse once cast its shadow across the Bavarian countryside, I'm struck by how completely a place can be erased from the physical world while remaining indelibly etched in human memory. The buildings are gone, the family is long dead, and even most of the original investigators have passed away. But the questions remain, as persistent as winter frost, as haunting as the wind through empty fields. 6 people died here in a manner so brutal and mysterious that we're still talking about it a century later, still searching for answers that may not exist, still trying to make sense of a crime that seems to defy human understanding. The memorial plaque bears the names of all 6 victims, a simple acknowledgement of lives cut short by violence. But it cannot capture the full tragedy of what happened here, the terror they must have felt in their final moments, the pain of a community torn apart by suspicion and fear, the anguish of investigators who dedicated years of their lives to a case they could never solve. The Hinterkaifeck murders represent more than just an unsolved crime. They're a reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization really is, how quickly safety can become terror, how easily a home can become a tomb. In our modern world, with our sophisticated forensic techniques and interconnected communication networks, it's tempting to believe that a crime like Hinterkaifeck couldn't happen today. But evil doesn't require primitive technology to flourish. It only requires opportunity, motive, and the kind of psychological detachment that allows one human being to destroy another. The tools may have evolved, but the capacity for violence remains as present now as it was in 1922. The question isn't whether such crimes can still occur. but whether we've learned enough from cases like Hinterkaifeck to prevent them, or, failing that, to solve them when they do. Dr. Sarah Mueller, a forensic psychologist who has studied the Hinterkaifeck case for over 2 decades, believes that the killer's behavior reveals a specific type of criminal psychology that was poorly understood in 1922 but is more recognizable today. The extended surveillance period, the intimate knowledge of the victim's routines, the comfort with remaining at the crime scene. These all point to someone with severe antisocial personality disorder, possibly combined with elements of psychopathy, she explained to me during our interview. This wasn't someone who killed in a moment of passion and immediately fled. This was someone who planned, executed, and then savored their crime in the most disturbing way possible. Dr. Mueller's analysis suggests that the killer was likely male, aged between 25 and 45, with significant local knowledge, but without strong community ties that would make disappearance difficult. The methodical nature of the murders, combined with the killer's ability to function normally while surrounded by decomposing bodies, indicates someone with profound emotional detachment and possible previous experience with violence. The post-mortem habitation of the house is particularly telling, Dr. Mueller noted. This behavior suggests someone who views other human beings as objects rather than people. Someone for whom the presence of corpses is no more disturbing than the presence of discarded furniture. The timing of the murders, just 4 years after the end of World War I, adds another layer to the psychological profile. Millions of men had returned from the trenches carrying trauma that their society had no framework for understanding or treating. Some had been so brutalized by their experiences that they struggled to readjust to civilian life, and a small percentage turned to violence as a way of processing their psychological wounds. Could the Hinterkaifeck killer have been one of these damaged souls? Someone who had lost the ability to distinguish between the battlefield and the farmyard, between enemy soldiers and innocent civilians? Over the decades, the Hinterkaifeck case has attracted its share of conspiracy theorists and amateur investigators, each convinced they've uncovered the truth that eluded professional investigators. Some believe the murders were connected to occult practices or satanic rituals, pointing to the positioning of the bodies and the symbolic significance of the number 6. Others argue that the killings were politically motivated, connected to the social upheaval that would eventually lead to the rise of the Nazi Party. While most of these theories lack credible evidence, they reflect the human need to find meaning in meaningless violence, to impose order on chaos, even when no order exists. One particularly persistent theory suggests that the murders were connected to treasure hunting, based on local legends about buried treasure on the property. According to this theory, the killer was searching for valuables that Andreas Gruber had supposedly hidden somewhere on the farm, and the murders were committed to eliminate witnesses to the theft. While investigators did find that Andreas kept larger amounts of cash than most farmers of the era, there was no evidence of missing valuables or disturbed ground that would suggest treasure hunting activities. Another theory focuses on the possibility of a cover-up by local authorities, either to protect a prominent member of the community or to avoid the scandal that would result from a proper investigation. Proponents of this theory point to inconsistencies in the police reports, evidence that may have been overlooked or deliberately ignored, and the surprisingly quick closure of the case despite the lack of a conviction. While corruption and incompetence were certainly possible in rural Bavaria in the 1920s, there's no concrete evidence to support claims of a deliberate cover-up. In 2007, the Bavarian State Police reopened the Hinterkaifeck case, hoping that modern investigative techniques might finally solve the 85-year-old mystery. A team of contemporary investigators, led by Detective Inspector Klaus Wagner, reviewed all the original evidence and applied current forensic methods to previously overlooked clues. "We approached this case as if it had happened yesterday," Wagner told me during our conversation. "We didn't want to be constrained by the assumptions and limitations of the original investigation. We started fresh and followed the evidence wherever it led us." The modern investigation revealed several crucial details that had been missed or misinterpreted by the original investigators. Advanced analysis of the murder weapon showed that it had been cleaned after the murders, but before being abandoned at the crime scene, suggesting that the killer had attempted to remove evidence. Microscopic examination of fabric fibers found at the scene revealed that the killer had likely worn clothing made from materials not commonly available in rural Bavaria, possibly indicating someone from a more urban environment or someone with access to imported goods. Perhaps most significantly, digital reconstruction of the crime scene revealed details about the sequence of the murders that hadn't been apparent to investigators in 1922. The positioning of the bodies and the blood spatter pattern suggested that the victims had been killed in a specific order, with Andreas Gruber likely being the first to die. This detail is crucial because it indicates that the killer had planned not just to murder the family, but to do so in a way that would minimize resistance and maximize psychological impact on the surviving victims. The modern investigation also benefited from access to historical records that weren't available to the original investigators. Census data, military records, and immigration documents allowed the contemporary team to track the movements of potential suspects more accurately and to identify individuals who might have had both the opportunity and the psychological profile to commit such a crime. This research revealed several previously unknown suspects, including traveling salesmen, itinerant workers, and displaced persons who had been in the area during the relevant time period. Despite the application of modern investigative techniques and the dedication of contemporary investigators, the 2007 reinvestigation ultimately reached the same conclusion as the original inquiry: insufficient evidence to identify the perpetrator with certainty. Detective Inspector Wagner acknowledged the frustration of this outcome, but emphasized that the case had provided valuable insights into both historical criminal behavior and the evolution of investigative techniques. "We may not have solved the mystery," he said, "but we've eliminated many false leads and identified several promising avenues for future investigation." One of the most frustrating aspects of the Hinterkaifeck case is that even if the killer's identity were definitively established today, justice would be impossible. The perpetrator, if still alive, will be well over 100 years old, and the statute of limitations for murder in Germany, though extended in recent decades, did not apply retroactively to cases from the 1920s. The investigation continues not for the possibility of prosecution, but for the sake of historical truth and the closure it might provide to those who have been haunted by this case for nearly a century. The Hinterkaifeck murders have become a teaching tool in criminology programs around the world, offering students insights into the challenges of investigating complex crimes with limited resources and technology. Professor Andreas Mayer of the Munich Institute of Criminology uses the case to illustrate how social context, investigative limitations, and the passage of time can all contribute to unsolved crimes. Hinterkaifeck represents a perfect storm of investigative challenges, he explains to his students. It's a case that teaches us as much about the limitations of justice as it does about the nature of criminal behavior. Joseph Gruber, the sole survivor of the Hinterkaifeck murders, lived for 69 years after that terrible night in March 1922. Adopted by relatives and raised far from the scene of the crime, he grew up with no memory of his family's fate and no knowledge of the case that had made him famous throughout Germany. It wasn't until he was in his 30s that he learned the truth about his origins, and even then, he chose to speak publicly about the case only rarely. when he died in 1991. He took with him any secrets he might have unconsciously retained from those traumatic early years. In the few interviews Joseph gave later in life, he expressed a complex mixture of gratitude for his survival and sorrow for the family he never knew. I sometimes wonder if I have memories buried so deep that I can't access them, he said in a 1987 interview. Dreams, feelings, impressions that might hold the key to what happened that night. But perhaps it's better that I don't remember. Some truths are too terrible to carry. His death marked the end of any direct connection to the Hinterkaifeck tragedy, leaving only documents, photographs, and theories to preserve the memory of that horrific night. The other survivors of the Hinterkaifeck case were the investigators, witnesses, and community members who lived with the knowledge of what had happened on that isolated farm. Many of them carried the psychological burden of the unsolved murders for the rest of their lives, haunted by questions they couldn't answer and justice they couldn't deliver. Detective George Rain Gruber reportedly suffered from nightmares about the case for years after his retirement, and several of the villagers who discovered the bodies never fully recovered from the trauma of that awful day. The Hinterkaifeck murders have inspired dozens of books, documentaries, films, and academic papers over the past century, becoming one of Germany's most famous unsolved crimes. Each new treatment of the case brings fresh theories and perspectives, but also risks sensationalizing a tragedy that claimed 6 lives and devastated a community. The challenge for any chronicler of this case is to maintain respect for the victims while acknowledging the legitimate public interest in understanding how such a crime could occur and remain unsolved. Hollywood and European filmmakers have been particularly drawn to the case, seeing in it all the elements of a perfect thriller. Isolated setting, mysterious circumstances, multiple suspects, and an ending that leaves audiences with more questions than answers. While these fictional treatments have helped keep the case in public consciousness, they've also contributed to the mythology surrounding the murders, sometimes blurring the line between established facts and dramatic speculation. The rise of true crime podcasts and digital media has brought renewed attention to the Hinterkaifeck case in recent years, with amateur investigators and armchair detectives proposing new theories and re-examining old evidence. While this grassroots interest has occasionally uncovered overlooked details or connections, it has also spawned numerous conspiracy theories and false leads that can complicate serious investigative efforts. The democratization of information has made the case more accessible to the public, but it has also made it more difficult to separate credible research from speculation and sensationalism. What can the Hinterkaifeck case teach us about safety, justice, and the nature of evil in our modern world? Perhaps the most important lesson is that isolation, while offering privacy and peace, can also make us vulnerable to those who would do us harm. The Gruber family's remote location, which had been their sanctuary, ultimately became their trap. In our interconnected age, with cell phones and security systems and neighbors who are rarely more than a few minutes away, it's easy to forget how vulnerable people were in 1922, how completely they could disappear without anyone knowing for days. From a forensic perspective, Hinterkaifeck demonstrates how much our understanding of evidence has evolved over the past century. Techniques that are routine today, DNA analysis, fingerprint comparison, ballistics testing, psychological profiling, were either non-existent or primitive in 1922. The original investigators did their best with the tools available to them, but they were fighting with medieval weapons against a modern enemy. Today's forensic capabilities might have made the difference between an unsolved mystery and a closed case. As the sun sets over the Bavarian countryside where the Hinterkaifeck farm once stood, I find myself thinking about the nature of unsolved mysteries and why they continue to fascinate us long after the participants have all passed away. Perhaps it's because they represent the limits of human knowledge and the boundaries of justice. They remind us that not every question has an answer, not every crime has a solution, and not every story has a satisfying ending. The Hinterkaifeck case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we live in. Evil exists. Good people suffer. Justice is not always served. Sometimes the bad guys get away with it. And sometimes we never even know who the bad guys were. These are not comforting thoughts, but they are necessary ones. They remind us to be vigilant, to look out for one another, and to never take our safety or our loved ones for granted. But perhaps the most important lesson of Hinterkaifeck is that the victims deserve to be remembered not just for how they died, but for how they lived. Andreas Gruber was a hardworking farmer who built a life from the soil with his bare hands. Kazilia Gruber was a mother and grandmother who had survived wars and hardships to see her family prosper. Victoria Gabriel was a young widow trying to build a safe future for her children. 7-year-old Kazilia was a child with dreams and possibilities that were cut short by violence. Maria Baumgartner was a young woman working to support herself in a difficult world. And little Joseph, though he survived, lost his entire family and grew up carrying the weight of a tragedy he could never fully understand. Standing here in the gathering darkness, where 6 lives ended so brutally and mysteriously nearly a century ago, I'm struck by how the past continues to reach into the present, how the dead continue to speak to the living through the questions they leave behind. The Hinterkaifeck murders may never be solved, but they will not be forgotten. They serve as a reminder that evil is real, that justice is fragile, and that the search for truth, even when it proves elusive, is always worthwhile. The killer of the Gruber family took their lives, destroyed their home, and escaped justice, but they could not erase their memory or silence their story. In some small way, every time we tell their tale, every time we search for answers, every time we refuse to let their case fade into obscurity, we strike a blow against the darkness that claimed them. We cannot bring them back, but we can ensure they are not forgotten. This has been the story of Hinterkaifeck, a mystery that has haunted Germany for nearly a century and continues to challenge our understanding of justice, evil, and the limits of human knowledge. 6 people died on that remote farm in March 1922, and their killer was never found. But their story lives on, a testament to the enduring human desire for truth and the refusal to let evil triumph completely, even when it seems to escape punishment. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of history's most perplexing mysteries, a case that continues to generate new theories and investigations even today. What do you think happened on that terrible night in March 1922? Do you believe the killer was someone the family knew, or a stranger who had been stalking them? Could modern forensic techniques finally solve this century-old puzzle? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you heard of the Hinterkaifeck case before? Do any of the theories we discussed seem more plausible than others? And if you're interested in more unsolved mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of Crime Story Chronicles. Tomorrow, we'll be exploring another baffling case that has puzzled investigators for decades. You won't want to miss it. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the truth is out there, waiting to be discovered. This is Crime Story Chronicles, and I'll see you in the next episode.